welcome to episode 325 of This Is Whole Life. And if you listen real closely, that's the sound of Jeff and Tammy driving down the interstate in Georgia and joining us via the podcast. And if you listen real closely, that's the sound of Ken sitting across from me doing the podcast. Ken is back after just 1 week, right?
Yeah.
You only missed 1 week.
Yeah. Only 1 week.
Yeah. And considering all that's been happening in your life, 1 week, that's pretty good.
You know what? I'll take it.
I'll take it. All right. Last week we were in the We Are Family series and we had Singles Arise. And unfortunately, right before we recorded, we had one more question that came in from an anonymous source and asked, as a shy and introverted divorced single, what can I do to not feel invisible at church? Ouch.
Oh, that's such a good question.
It is a good question, but
it makes you feel a little sad, too.
A little sad, yeah.
You don't want anybody to feel invisible at church, and this person does. So, what a great question. Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it's not an uncommon question, is it? Because of all places, church is that place where you would think that, we use the word family, and it's a place where most people want to be seen, at least on the level of love and, some kind of attention in some way. So, yeah, it's hard. First of all, I guess we should say that it's not just single people that we hear that from, too. That
Right,
we do hear that from other people besides. So, first of all, you're not alone in thinking that, because sometimes churches can be places where it's hard for lots of different types of people, depending on what's going on. I think sometimes when you think about, especially if you're shy, you're a little inhibited, I think one of the things, if you're asking for a solution, I think there's some things that we could do. We could become involved. There's lots of places where people are saying, hey, what about joining, a team, whether it's, I've had people come to me and say, well, what's available? And sometimes it's just looking and seeing where you might be a part of a small group, part of a service team, using some of your skills and talents on, some of the things and areas. But in terms of what, in a church, I guess I would, reach out and say, what about seeing somebody who's sitting across from you and just saying hi, or, becoming kind of a greeter on your own, so to speak, where you just reach out and, see maybe there's another person that might be thinking the exact same thing that you are.
I think it's tough because a lot of times as a married person who hasn't been single for a long, long time, it's not like I sit around and think about, I wonder what the single people are doing. And in fact, probably the opposite. I'm like, man, look at all them single people having a life. And, I'm going home so my kids can take a nap and, we can survive the rest of the day, maybe without any meltdowns, or we're looking for another family that might have similar type aged kids or similar, activities that they like to do. And so I think this really speaks to both of them, both, the message last week and this week, where we have to find our unity in Christ in ourselves, and then also in the people around us, as our church family, whether we're married or whether we're single, or that small group. And I mean, if someone was looking to get in touch with a small group, can they come and talk to you on a Saturday morning, Jeff? Is that what they would do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's the part that I think about myself. I think about other people that are on staff. We're all there for that very real reason, is to be available for those kind of one-on-one conversations. And sometimes it's hard, like you say, maybe it's an anonymous question right now just because nobody wants to be called out for that. But,
yeah,
having people that you can reach out to is part of the reason why we have family.
Yeah.
And the reason I said that it's more than just single people is because we have married people who come to church who feel even estranged or invisible in their own families, whether they be siblings or children, or even parents or husbands and wives. There's all sorts of people who come for different reasons, and it's a hard thing to deal with.
I read something this week that really stuck with me, and I mentioned it to someone else, and they were like, wow, I've never thought about it that way before. And it was a quote attributed to somebody. I'm sure if you looked it up online, it would probably only be 10 or 12 people that would be attributed to, probably. But it said, blood makes you related, love makes you family. And so I think that as you come to Whole Life Church, and a lot of new faces that we see every week and people that you talk to, and that theme that, Ken has been preaching since he got here is family. He opens with it, he closes with it on message, and I think it's becoming a part of just who we are, and because of its intentionality, which is exactly what we want. So I'm hoping that even if you don't feel like you have any blood relatives, that you'll find family here at Whole Life Church. Ken, anything to add?
Right on point, Randy. Right on point.
Well, because we're gonna get into the meat of the matter, because I felt like both the singles and the marriage message, these were amazing messages, and I think as good a message as you'll ever hear, just breaking everything down to its biblical beginnings, its context, when it was written, why it was written, and maybe ways we should look at it that we haven't before. And Ken started off with two velvet sledgehammers. One was, he started out with the word submission.
Oh, yeah.
Which everyone immediately goes, ooh, warm and fuzzies.
Yeah, I heard a groan. It was funny.
There is an audible groan.
There was an audible groan.
And then he followed it up with object. And when you make your mate an object, and, Ken was very transparent, as if we all are being honest, we can admit the same thing, that we've all looked at our significant other or spouse, no matter how long you've been married, there's still
especially how long you've been married. Yeah.
But you can tend to look at them as an object. And I wouldn't always say that it's nefariously that you do that. It's very easy to slip into that, oh, well, they usually do that for me, so now I expect it. Or then the game of, well, you do that and I do this, and we kind of know that. That's kind of like our deal. But then when the deal for some reason doesn't happen, and then it's like, well, wait a minute, now the whole apple cart is tipped over because somebody didn't do what they were supposed to do in our little non-said agreement. And when you put those together, it's something that I think if you're married and you watched it, it really hit home, because it's something that every marriage has come across, again, whether we're going to be honest with ourselves or not. But being prepared and knowing that it's there is completely different. And I had to laugh because early on, Ken told the story about Eric. I don't even want to tell it. Just tell him, because in case somebody missed the message, I want them to hear this story from you, because it just made me laugh out loud as a parent.
Yeah, and the sad thing, by the way, for any parents, I apologize if you went home and your child said something to you, or shows like, I wonder if there would have been a way to tell that story a little differently so you didn't have kids. But the story goes like this. Eric had come home on a break, and there were some dishes in the sink, and I said, hey, Eric, can you do the dishes? And he said, sure. And a couple hours later, the dishes are still there. And I was feeling fresh, and I said, Eric, come on, let's get it done. And Eric says, chill, bro. Why so aggressive? And it was just the way he said it. It actually made me laugh. And it was like, it sounds like he was being disrespectful. He wasn't. Anyway, so we helped him understand that I'm chill and you can still do the dishes. Thank you for doing that right now. But as I was kind of thinking about one of the things in my relationship with my wife, and I think probably a lot of people can relate in with your own spouse if you're married. Is there's just a lot of times where I get way more aggressive than I need to because I'm not willing to do that whole thing that I talked about, that word that we don't like, and so I get aggressive.
That one?
That one.
One.
And so instead of chilling and just kind of just taking it easy and being like, hey, I can slow down a little here. I don't have to get aggressive on this. I can back off. I get aggressive. I'm like, hey,
We all do. The hair goes up on the back of our neck, and it's like, I must defend.
Yeah.
And then later on, you kind of go, why? I mean, why did I defend in that moment when it's okay, the dishes, let's just stay there and let's just not say it's Eric, it's you and your wife. And it's like, someone's got to do the dishes, right? Whether it's put them in the dishwasher or whatever the routine is at your house. And I think Ken and I are a lot alike in that respect, where first off, I'll tend to I'll pop off back like, well, I was doing something too, I just haven't been not doing whatever. Like, what are you accusing me of?
I did the dishes for the last 3 nights,
because men are good at keeping track of things. And
certain things,
things, and the others not so much. But the dishes, I can tell you how many times I've done dishes. Ken gave us 4 things, the 4 C's: chill, curious, commitment, and control.
And stay away from control. C's that control is the bad C right there.
Where was the C was the bad C. It's 3 C's.
There's 3 C's and a 4th to stay away from.
And the 4th was that's right. Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, I didn't finish reading that one. I highlighted them.
So chill.
See, this is why Ken needs to be on the podcast, because
just to make sure
exactly.
I'm a little afraid from last week now that I think about it. Probably should go listen to that podcast.
Probably should go listen. Make sure I'm not putting words in your mouth.
Yeah, in fact, but it's so important to stay away from that. You think about a lot of what we do, and when you think about submission, most of the time what we think of, I don't want to be controlled by somebody. And if I submit, that's what's going to happen. I'm going to get controlled, and I'm going to be manipulated. I'm going to be pushed around, and a lot of times when you hear one spouse tell the other one, well, you just need to, you need to submit. What we're really dealing with is a control issue. It's like, well, I have no other card to play, so I'm just going to play the you need to submit card and do what I want you to do. And I'll go ahead and pull out a Bible verse that supports what I want, or a quote from some other place. And then you have to do it because I'm controlling.
Yeah.
And so we want to stay away from that.
I thought the chill is, you said kind of like take a deep breath and submit, and just kind of, to me, that meant just chill and put yourself in the moment without the preconceived idea of what that person meant.
Yeah.
And then you said curious. What did they? Why did they? Why did I?
Yeah.
Like, what happened here? And I think that the curious part to me might be the one that if we spent the most time on the curious, because if I understand and I kind of get an idea of why certain situations that repeat in marriage, just like any other relationship, if you can kind of figure out that curious part, like, why did that bother you?
Yeah.
And I'm not attacking, I'm not putting words in your mouth. I just want to know why, because this is how it made me feel. This is what I'm seeing. And if it's something completely different, a lot of the times you can kind of scratch a lot of the little ones off the list, and there might be big ones that you really have to work on. But if you're constantly stumbling over the little ones, it makes the big ones seem even just like almost insurmountable, at least to me. And then the commitment part, I loved how, and I had this idea in my head, and it was, Beastie Boys, you got to fight for your right to party, right? And it's and now follow me here.
I'm sticking with you.
I'm sticking with it. If you've ever seen the music video, it's like the most mayhem you could ever pack into a bunch of teenagers making, we're fighting for our right to party. And you said basically 2 people can't fight for their own rights every day without submitting to each other. And if you just see the mayhem, and man, that takes a toll on everyone. It just makes things seem so tense all the time and so heavy. And
chill, bro.
Yeah, just chill, bro. Chill. Why are you coming at me so hard, so aggressive? And because it almost makes the control part, to me, there's very few people I want to give control to.
Yeah.
I'm not good at giving control to Jesus, and I should, right? He's the most trustworthy.
Right.
But if I stop and think about my life, and I think about who would I give control to without question? And for me, that's my spouse, Heather. Because even though we may have problems here and there and in whatever parts that we disagree on, or at the end of the day, I know who has my back. Mm-hmm. And it's always her. It's always been her. So I think when you take the three, the chill, curious, and the commitment, and you realize Jesus' metaphor, that's the metaphor for our relationship with him, then when you look at control, at least to me, that the control was actually one of my favorite parts. Because even though there's a lot of people I wouldn't want to give control of my life, my wife is one of them. And so that actually made me feel, for me, that part of the message was a plus, where maybe it's a minus for some people. But I think as you come through those, it helps with that control part. But the thing I've really found that I hadn't heard before when someone preaches on Ephesians is the context. The way you talked about how Paul is writing it, and if and then you apply those norms and you look at what he's actually saying, that's something I wouldn't miss, and I wouldn't try to recreate it myself here. So definitely don't miss the message. But if you could talk about that a little bit, because I think that's the part where people are like, oh, it's another submit to your wives and husbands and this, but you brought in the wives, the concubines, and the context and all of the hierarchy of the society that they lived in that he wrote this to. And that to me made a huge difference on how I took in chill, curious, and commitment. It really did.
Yeah. For those who believe strongly in women's equality, this Ephesians 5 can be a pretty difficult chapter to swallow, because there's a lot of talk about your husband is the head, just like Christ is the head of the church, and and you need to submit to your husband. And a lot of times when people start quoting those verses, they again forget the verse that comes right before the verse that says, wives, this means submit to your husbands, is the verse right before it says, I want you all to submit to each other.
Right, yeah.
It's not simply a call for women to submit. There's a call in there for men to submit as well. And so I think and just basically it's a call for all of us to live a life where if we love somebody, that we're willing to go ahead and allow them more latitude in our lives to do things. And Paul is talking to the church in Ephesus. The church in Ephesus is going through a lot, and Paul is calling them to unity. This is kind of the big theme, overall arching theme of that, according to the Adventist Bible Commentary. And if you just read the book, you'll see it.
Right.
But it's a call to unity, and unity rarely occurs by a dictator. That's more of herding than it is. The kind of unity that Christ was talking about was a voluntary submission on the individual's part, not a coercion where you force somebody into doing something against their will, but you or in spite of what they want. And so Paul is talking about that Christ-like unity that comes from a voluntary surrender of myself, a voluntary submission of myself. And when you get into Ephesians 5, he's still on that unity theme, and he's talking about what it would look like inside of a marriage. And there were kind of household codes that were out there. And in Ephesus, a man was the unquestioned head of his home. The woman did not have any kind of veto power. Whatever the man's decision was what the man's decision was. And in a lot of Roman society, there was kind of a rule that women could own property, but only if their father and their husband died first, and then you could own it. So you essentially, women were a wife in Ephesus was really their primary purpose was to create legitimate children in a marriage to carry on the family name and heritage. And beyond that, there was no purpose for that person in that society, that the man was more than welcome to have multiple sexual partners and other people and so a wife wasn't, the intimacy that we often think about in American society was just not the same thing in Ephesus. No. And so Paul does something quite revolutionary when he tells men that they need to love their wives. That would have blown their minds. What are you talking about? What do you mean I need to love my wife? What's that? I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, it's like me telling, it's like me saying, Randy, you need to love your comb. And Randy is like, oh, well, I like it and it serves a purpose, but I
don't think I love it.
What's the point of loving that? I mean, that's not what. I mean, you don't love a comb.
Right.
And that's how, and I say that in this sense that would have sounded as ridiculous as that sounds for me to say that you need to love your comb. You have to understand that Ephesian men, when they heard that, would have felt equally ridiculous. Oh, you need to love your wife. Well, who does that? I mean, what's the point of that? That's why.
Right, yeah.
And so it's just a revolutionary thing. And then Paul takes it further and says, you have to love her the same way that Christ loved the church and lay down your life for her.
That was the one right there that, when you think about it in that context, that has to change your idea of, how you look at your spouse if you've never looked at it that way before you got married.
A lot of people, when they say, when they start talking about this headship thing, they're talking about, I'm in charge, you need to listen to me and do what I say. That's the whole, I'm the leader, I'm in charge, I'll take your opinion into consideration, of course, but at the end of the day, I get to make the final decision. If we're going to then listen to what Paul is saying, he said, you've got to lead like Christ, you got to be the head like Christ, and Christ did not die so that each one of us had to have salvation. He died so that we could choose whether we wanted to accept salvation. And so I think that's a really important thing to think about, that a Christ-like leadership style is a leadership style that allows people to make their choice, that allows them to come along out of love instead of out of coercion. And the problem is, it just goes right back, like I talked about, to Genesis, where do we want to live in the curse, or do we want to live in the new reality of Christ? Do we want to live under the woman will vie for control in the relationship, and the husband will vie for control and will basically oppress her, is what's saying is, because that's what happens when you get two selfish people seeking what's best for themselves. It's going to be a bloodbath. When two selfish people trying to fight for their rights, neither one's ever going to win, because the other one will always be undermining the other one.
Yeah.
And it's just back and forth. And so that's where submission has to come into it, as much as we don't like that word.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to submit. You have to be willing to say, you know what? It's not what I want, but if that's what's good for you, I care about you more than I care about me.
I care about
I care about what's good for you.
I was just going to ask you, Jeff. I mean, what do you?
I think that's the piece that does get missed in all of this, is that, matter of fact, I think there was a question brought in, and I like how Ken, you brought up the idea of, why didn't Paul just flat out say, hey, you're both equal? Well, first of all, the culture of that day, or at least society of that day, was that the woman didn't have a choice. But now Paul is laying it out. You have basically heard this come down through, literally since the fall. But now he's literally liberating, because now he's saying submission is a choice to the woman as well.
Mm-hmm.
That what you do with your choice now matters in this relationship. So he's literally empowering women and men to make this choice. You now have a choice. And whether or not you're going to try to rule or control or try to figure out ways in which aren't going to be constructive ways to now deal with equitability and within a relationship. Now he's saying, wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, you submit to your wives as well. And so you submit to each other. This is how a real marriage works now moving forward. And he's actually honoring the choice that each person has within that relationship.
Yeah.
So I think we have to look at it from that standpoint, that this is very, just like Ken said, it's a very radical statement, not from the standpoint of, oh, well, what choice do I have? I'm a wife, I live in, first century, Roman, province here. I have no choice. Of course I'm going to submit. No, he's actually saying this is a choice. You do have this choice. Make this choice for the relationship, for the way in which God decides to build unity in the church. And I think that's a very, very important piece that sometimes goes ignored, that Paul is giving, freedom of choice within this, as he asks that of the women and the men.
It's really beautiful when you think about it. It was a radical concept then, and it's a radical concept now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to jump into the questions here pretty soon, but I wanted to give just a little bit of time to both Jeff and Ken. If there was one thing you could say to someone who they've heard the message here about being single, being married, and if they're in, and they're in a relationship, whether that be, they're still single but they're looking to marriage, or they're in a marriage and there's issues, and what do we do to try to make sure we're solid, or we can get back to solid, or we prepare for solid? That's a lot of questions. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting within relationships. You have two very, very basic fears. One is the fear of loneliness and being alone and being left alone. And the other one is the fear of losing, my independence and losing control, so to speak, of my own life.
Yeah.
And and those kind of work against each other sometimes, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you're, even internally, we see things within our own lives, that and single people, they don't like the thought of, what life looks like being alone. That's a hard thing to deal with. I feel lonely. And usually what ends up happening is I'm going to get somebody else to solve that issue for me. And Ken mentioned this actually in the later part of his talk, is, in terms of 100% of you is expected within a relationship, not 50%, but 100%. And that's a really important thing. And I think my best advice to people that are either in a relationship or seeking a relationship is that whenever you have an intimacy with somebody else, and I don't mean this in a sexual way, I mean, anytime you have an intimate relationship, there's always three different entities. There's myself, there's the other person, there's you, and there's us. And really the work is going to, your responsibility is obviously taking care of yourself, but also taking care of the us part. That's where you get a chance to do that 100% piece goes into us as well. And so in a relationship, a lot of times we very rarely will look at the other person, especially men, have a hard time looking at the other person through the us lens. And I know that's a little nuanced right there, but women from the early on, maybe it's because they didn't have the testosterone to split their brain hemispheres in half, or I'm not exactly sure. But women, they learn very quickly, very early on, how to be in relationship. It takes us a little longer for some reason as men. We're much more captivated by competition, and I know I'm making huge generalities here.
They're not wrong,
but
though.
because I don't want to get caught in these, this is how men are different from women. But we do struggle a little bit with being able to see my partner through us lenses. There's a lot of times we get into a competitive kind of a posture with our wives, and sometimes, well, not sometimes, most of the time, that does not work out well. And I think it's really important that as we see our relationship, that we are constantly feeding that us piece, doing inclusion within that relationship, where now I take on this idea of I am no longer just myself in this relationship. I'm part of a coupling that takes place where I literally, truly see how I can not get my wife to, not be herself, because that's a complete other entity. She gets to be herself. I get to be myself. But we also have this other piece where we're not only fostering a huge future for us, but also eventually mentoring for other people as well.
I don't think
see what.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
To see what God actually looks like in our marriage.
Maybe it's just me, but I don't think anyone really. I mean, in premarital counseling, I remember a little bit about, that we part, but I don't think it gets emphasized enough that, there's me and I don't want to change, and it's you and you don't want to change. And then nobody, people don't think about, or at least maybe I didn't think about, how much you're going to grow. And I don't think anyone can know that until you actually do it, and how much the idea that, hey, at this point in time, everything aligns, but there's going to be times when I'm me and you're you, and those really don't align. And then we have to find ways to make those align again, or we have to come to some kind of agreement with that. So I love that we part. I think that's great advice to be thinking about if you haven't already, that maybe a lot of the keys land in that we part that maybe we just haven't gotten to yet. Everything's been pretty good. And then when the we doesn't quite work like it's supposed to, I think the tendency is to blame the other person because they're not trying hard enough. And, maybe they don't realize it either. Maybe they're not in that place yet where they're seeing the we. So I really like that we advice, Jeff. That's awesome. Ken, what's the last thing you want someone, if they forget everything else you said over the course of this message, what's the one thing that you hope that they walk away with?
That submission isn't a dirty word.
Oh, nice. Nice. No, and that's powerful.
Yeah, that submission is a necessary part of any healthy relationship.
I like it. All right.
It's how the we gets formed, actually.
Yep.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. Okay. Well, let's get on to the questions. Our first question is from Sharon Schofield Marquez. She asks, why is it that our behavior always seems worse with those close and who we love?
Because there's nowhere to hide.
Oh, yeah.
There's nowhere to hide. I think that with people that you aren't close to, you're able to kind of go ahead and just deal with it for the amount of time. Well, mature people are able to do that. I don't know. I always can do that, but you know what I'm saying? But but overall you can then you can go home and whine and gripe about what's going on there. But when you live with somebody, there's really nowhere to run or hide from it. And that's kind of one of the beauties of it, is that you have to face it. You can't evade it. And maybe that's one of the truest forms of yourself, and you have to admit, I do have anger issues here, or I do speak in ways I'm not proud of. And so I think it's, for me, it's, there's just nowhere to hide.
Yeah.
I think that's a good question too, from the standpoint of there's history. There's so much more history with somebody who's been close to you, especially if you've been there, a little bit of time.
Yeah.
And, a lot of times we think, well, history is just going to get used against me, but it also can be used for you. And that's the part where I think, for couples, especially couples who have been together for a long time, if all you're doing is, spending time and just going through time without intentionally building trust, eventually those pieces will be brought up against you as indictments, right?
Yeah.
But if you're spending that time to realize, hey, here's a person who knows everything about me, and yet I still want to be with this person because I trust what they know about me. and how they'll bring it back around, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I think, Ken mentioned that too. I want somebody who sees me at my worst
and still loves me. Yeah.
and still wants to spend time with me. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think what you bring back as well, like if it's back and forth with, we're going to bring up and we're going to rehash old things that were negative. Let's have a session where we bring up and rehash wonderful memories, because I find that, when you find those things that a lot of times you're like, what should we do? I'm bored, or I think, we should do this, we should do that. And it's like a lot of the things that you used to enjoy, maybe before you had kids or when the relationship was newer, those are things that you probably still enjoy. You just haven't done because you either haven't had the time or the resources to do them. Instead of rehashing what we all know our bad parts are and what our mistakes are, I like to sometimes try to turn it around and find opportunities when somebody brings back a memory and go, man, do you remember when we did this? And you get that same laugh because it's still fun. It's still a memory that you have that only you have together. And I think that's sometimes a way to kind of diffuse and move off track and kind of turn it back to a different and more positive outlook.
Yeah.
All right. Jahimi said, where is godly love during living in with a girlfriend and having children? Is it Christianly acceptable? How do you deal with it redemptively?
I'm not exactly sure. There's two ways you could probably go with that question. I think what he's coming from is he's saying we as a church, if we're going to be Christian, should we call out people that are living together?
Okay.
I'm assuming that's where he's coming from, because couples who I think where he's saying is couples that have chosen to move in together, so to speak, without being married, are we being Christian by not calling them out? I'm assuming that's what they're saying.
That's how I took the first part too.
This is a touchy situation. We actually we have I hope we have created an understanding within our church. I can't speak for all churches.
Sure.
But within our church, where we all are flawed people, we all make mistakes. I've had, and I'm sure Ken has too, I've married couples, and afterwards, as I watched them go through some pretty rough times in their life and then get a divorce, I wondered, did I do them a service? Was my blessing a favor to them? So, all of these things, in terms of being Christian, God asks us to be loving, accepting, and he asks us to be merciful. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and saying that the church is not, I don't think God put the church in place so that we could ride herd over people's decisions and make social justice kind of mandates for people to run their lives, to ruin or to bless. So I do think that sometimes we get involved with these things and we call it Christian, when in actuality it is being somewhat oppressive. And I would hate to think that I'd rather err on the lane of being unoppressive and then giving people good advice and hopefully they'll follow it. I don't like getting into people's decisions as to how they should run their lives, and then we're going to excommunicate them as a church because they made a mistake. I guess that's the best way of saying it.
Jeff, I think it's an interesting question in the sense that more and more people are living together before they get married, and that's a rising issue within the Christian church. And church, not just the Seventh-day Adventist church, but the Christian church has overall said it's best to get married. And so one of the questions that we have to look at is, why are people doing that? Why are people living together before they get married? And I think that I don't have the data in front of me, but I would suspect that there a number of the people that live together before they get married lived in situations where they saw parents that were not happy together, that were really did not make marriage attractive, or made it seem like I don't want to go through the pain that I saw my parents go through when they got divorced. Yep. And so I would suspect that would be a pretty big reason why that may happen. And so here's my advice to Christians who want to do something about people living together. Have a functional marriage that is a shining example of how wonderful marriage is. If you want to be preaching, that's the preaching that you ought to do. And let me be clear, I do think, by the way, especially when you have children, it's so important to have two parents at home if possible. And let's be honest, again, we live in a world where everything's not the way that we always wish it would be, okay? And so let's be careful when we start throwing stones at somebody else. Jesus talked about, the speck in your eye or in somebody else's eye, and you've got a log in your own. So I think we have to be a little bit careful, but it may be one of the logs in some Christian eyes is we want to pick on the behavior that isn't biblical. At the same time, we're living unbiblically in a sense that we make marriage unattractive by the way that we go about doing it. Those who use their authority in marriage to push down the other partner in that marriage and to dominate. So I think that if we really want to speak about, if we really want people to believe marriage is a beautiful thing, those of us who are married ought to live a beautiful marriage, and one that makes our children and the children that we come into contact go, oh, I want that when I grow up. And that's how we do it. And I will just say, for those of you who may be thinking about cohabitating before you get married, and you're doing it to try to avoid pain that you've seen, the statistics are against you. And what I mean by that is that all the statistics say that people who cohabitate before they get married have a higher divorce rate than those who don't. And I'm not, again, picking, but I'm just saying statistics are statistics. And you can do a lot of different things with them. But every study that I look at says that living together actually lowers your probability of lasting versus getting married. And so that's just something to think and take into account as you're making those decisions about what you're going to do and how you're going to go about doing things. But let me tell you this, as a broken person, I can tell you that God does an amazing job of helping people who put their trust in Him to get through the brokenness of life, and Christ never leaves or abandons us.
Yeah. No, anyone that asks me that question, because my first marriage, it was a cohabitation to start with, and the one thing that you hope that any relationship that you're in that does not end the way you'd like it is that you would learn something from it. And the thing that I learned from that is I would have never done that again, cohabitating before getting married. Like you said, the statistics are against it, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And I'm not going to go into all of them. It doesn't matter, but it's just something that when you do it and you know how it makes you feel, and then you get married to the right person, it's two different things. It's not the same thing, and it seems like it at the beginning when you're like, "Oh, it seems like a good idea," and then I don't think there's a big difference, and there really is. So I'm always like, look, you don't have to take my word for it, but as someone who's been there, that's just one of the things that when that relationship was over, I'm like, I will never live with someone again unless I'm married to them. And that was my first and probably the largest hard rule that came out of that relationship. Because once you realize, again, it's just a completely different thing. All right, our last question. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I just want to say, more and more we're finding couples who are thinking about, they're serious, they're thinking about getting married, they're thinking about probably maybe figuring out something that's going to be long-term for them. and they sometimes say, well, let's try the move-in part. I would suggest, rather than moving in, but to, it's happening more and more these days, is to find a good counselor. A lot of counselors now are doing premarital work as opposed to just marital work. And sometimes now dating, it does, and by the way, it's the reason why it doesn't always have great statistics behind it, because it has to do with one of Ken's C's, and that is commitment. It's a much lower level of commitment.
Yeah, for sure.
So maybe find a counselor. Maybe that should be a fourth C.
Counselor. I like that.
That's right. There you go. And that's one of the good C's.
Then. That's a good C.
Yeah, good C.
Yeah, good C. All right.
Well, I like that, Jeff. I like that a lot because, people have legitimate concerns going to marriage, and it's nobody. I think especially as the generation that's coming of age right now, getting married, they've seen so much divorce and they've seen so much pain, and the pain that comes through a divorce, that they don't want that. They don't want that in their life, and so they're just trying to find some way. And if you're intuitive, it would seem intuitively, well, if I try out low commitment first and see how that goes, then I'll understand. If I live with them for a while, I'll kind of understand how things work, and it'll tell me whether I should go to the next level of commitment. But sometimes our intuition doesn't actually work the way, sometimes our intuition can be wrong. And in this particular case, Jeff is a counselor. You can probably speak to it more, but I think that suggestion of going and seeing a counselor and really kind of digging into who you guys are. I know that both Jeff and I use a really great. Well, Jeff, I don't know. Are you still using Prepare Enrich, or do you use something different?
Yeah, I've used it in the past. I kind of modified it a little bit, but yeah.
So
love that.
So we use a tool called Prepare Enrich. It's does kind of an inventory of you as a couple, and it looks at different areas of importance in your relationship, from your spirituality, your communication, to your ability to resolve conflict, all kind. I mean, it's a bunch of other things as well, and it just kind of looks at how you match up in those areas. And it's not a tool that says, "Oh, don't get married." In fact, when you get trained to use this tool, one of the things they tell you is never tell somebody that they shouldn't get that. The tool isn't telling them not to get married. It's just telling them the areas that are going to be areas of strength and areas for opportunity for growth. And strength areas can turn into opportunities for growth if you don't tend to them. So there's a lot of really great tools out there for you if you're really wanting to know whether you're compatible, that can help you, and some great Christian counselors out there that can be. So Jeff, I thought that was a really great piece of advice.
And counseling is a lot cheaper than getting divorced.
Oh,
that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, as expensive as you think that is. I have some close friends that are just wrapping up their divorce, and I'm if I understand correctly, they've spent nearly $250,000.
And that's not even the emotional toll.
No, and that's like the money's the easy part.
Yeah, the emotional toll is what'll get you eventually.
Yep.
All right, our last question comes from Tito, and he asked, should a husband be respected if they are verbally abusive, even when they are being that way out of spite? Like in returning abuse for abuse is what I'm getting off of that.
So the answer is going to, and please hear this all the way to the end. So the answer is yes, but sometimes respect is drawing boundaries. And what that means is if somebody's being verbally abusive, sometimes the respectful thing to that person to say, no, I am not going to allow myself to be treated that way. And that's a respectful thing to do when said correctly and when executed correctly. And so, you know what? I think that my wife, no matter how she's behaving, deserves my respect at all times.
Absolutely.
And my love at all times.
Yep.
Now, and so I would say the same is true back on the other side. I would like to think that my wife will love and respect me at all times. But respect, I think, shouldn't be construed as meaning do what you're told to do. So, or to accept abuse. That's not. Respect doesn't mean that you do what the person tells you to do. Respect means that you live within the boundaries that are healthy. And Jeff, I think you can probably say it better than I can, but do you agree with what I'm saying, or does that make sense to you?
I agree totally. Abuse is, and by the way, a lot of times what I find, and you probably have found this as well, when you get couples in, they have a different measure or a different view of what abuse is.
Yeah.
Sometimes how they were raised. I've had couples that, hey, I'm not raising my voice, and they're literally raising their voice in the session. Right?
I never raise my voice.
No, this isn't raising my voice.
Because of how they see themselves, and so one person's level is maybe a little different than another person's level. Then I'm going to go back to these kinds of things again. Sometimes you need a third set of eyes on them. Either way, when you feel like you're being abused or disrespected, there is no room. There's no room there in a marriage where that can continue. So if you do feel that way, and sorry about that. That's somebody got in the way of a truck. So, but
hopefully that wasn't you.
that wasn't me, but I was next to him. There's somebody being abused. If I was to be that perpetrator, so to speak, I would want to know that, and that's what makes this whole submission. This is where it means. You said it in the beginning. This is what it means to be submissive. Is that now I get a chance to literally play out what I said I was going to be, the kind of husband I was going to be. If my wife or my partner is saying, I feel like I'm being abused by your language and how you talk and how you speak or how your attitude is when you fashion statements about me, then rather than doubling down and saying, I'm not going down that road and being defensive, why don't we spend time to try to figure out what that looks like? And a lot of times that's really, really hard. But the abuser, I know Tito's questions about the one being abused and should he stay. If your partner can't dialogue and be a part of that conversation, then you owe it to yourself, but also to your partner to make a drastic change and say, okay, maybe I need to step away from this relationship for a while. And, because sometimes those things need drastic measures. And you know as well as I do, Ken, sometimes it takes a little bit of a wake-up call for some people before they can make a change.
Well, it does. I remember one particular marriage I was working with where I begged the woman to leave for a little while. I said, I'm not asking you to divorce. I'm just asking you to please walk away and don't come back until this behavior has been demonstrated to have changed. And that's going to be not over the course of a week. That's, we're talking about that they can demonstrate over a course, and let that person woo you back. Let them demonstrate that. And it broke my heart that this marriage, the person wasn't willing to do that. They weren't willing to do it. And the marriage broke. It broke. There's divorce. And I've always wondered if that person had been willing to do the hard thing of putting some physical distance for a little while, if they could have saved it long term. And again, I think, I've had spouses be like, how can you tell my spouse to do that? You're a pastor. You can't say that. And I say, well, of course I can say that. You are behaving in a way that is hurting somebody. You can't. Of course, I can tell them to not put themselves in harm's way. Of course, I can tell them to do that. And it's not the same thing as saying get divorced. In fact, it's exactly what I'm trying to save you from. I want to save your marriage long term. And sometimes in the short term, you've got to go ahead and get some distance if you can. And sometimes that's the only thing that'll bring somebody to the table to be an honest broker. Mm. And sometimes then they won't come. Even sometimes then they won't come. Yeah. but far
Right.
better to be, even if they won't come to the table, you can take the time you need to talk to a counselor and to get yourself into a healthy place. Most people don't realize when they're in an abusive situation, they have no idea just how abused they are in that moment. They don't have perspective, and they need space to get perspective on what's really happening in their life, what they're doing, the part that's going on in their life. And don't get me wrong, there's no excuse for abuse. So, but everybody plays a part in brokenness.
Yep.
And so being aware of the parts that we play is important too.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing that we haven't talked about in this question is if there are other people in the home, namely children.
Yep.
Children do not differentiate between physical and verbal abuse. They see it the same way. So the damage could be, in other words, if a husband is being verbally abusive to his wife and there are children present, to a young child, that's just as damaging as if he were to hit his wife.
Wow.
So it can be a pretty serious deal. And so, well, I'm just yelling at her, or I'm just calling her names. That's not hitting her. There is very little differentiation for a child when that's being done. So that's a pretty big deal.
And I think equally, Jeff, when people are calling each other names, and verbal abuse can sometimes be pretty hard to define. At the same time, when you are doing things that make another person feel less than, that are damaging their self-esteem, that are pulling them down, that's incredibly damaging to a person. We tend to go ahead and focus on the physical abuse, but when you are verbally abusive, it can really impact people's self-esteem, their ability to do their jobs, their ability to parent well. And so that's why it's not just words. It's not like oh, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Words will kill you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so we have to be careful and understand that the words we use in our marriage can be every bit as damaging as physical abuse if we're not careful.
And not to mention that usually when things are not, in a sense, addressed, when you become a verbal abuser, it's the next step is the physical abuse. So don't think that it just stays there too. So.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of good advice we packed into this hour. So I hope that over the course of the singles and the marriages, the two messages, I think we have some good groundwork for people that had some questions, and I think we provided some answers. But it seems like one of the most important things is that you have someone to talk to. You have someone that you rely on or that's safe for you. And if you don't have that person, that you would seek out professional help to find someone to talk to, because so many times we find out from people after the fact, and it's like, wow, how lonely they were, or they didn't want to share with someone because they were ashamed or they were scared, or, for all those different reasons. So, and if you have any questions, send them in. And if it needs to be confidential, if it needs to be away from the podcast, I'd like to think that we can at least connect people with resources that really need them. And we care, and we want to make sure that everyone is as safe and happy as possible. So don't hesitate to reach out if you need to. All right. Next week is We Are Family, Arise in Your Season. And there's a weird name on my screen right now. It says
it looks all familiar, doesn't it?
It says Andy McDonald. Andy McDonald. Who's this guest speaker?
This is our senior pastor emeritus. I am so excited that he's agreed to come back. We were talking about it. We had a different plan for this week, but due to some things that were occurring, we needed to do something different. And so just so grateful that Andy was willing to step in and do this this sermon. He's kind of complained a little to me. He's like,
Did
it's
he?
kind of cliche that you're having
Did he
me
really?
talk about. So if you're listening to this, Andy, I'm sorry, man. I mean, but man, we're thrilled to have you back in the back up at the pulpit.
So Jeff, are you going to be back next week for the podcast?
Yeah.
So that means that next week, in episode 326, it'll be the first time in over a year, well over probably 2 years, because we didn't meet together during COVID, that the three of us have been in this little office/studio on second floor at church, where it all began in episode 1 amidst a pile of boxes and Dad's root beer.
Andy, and Jeff.
Andy, Randy, and Jeff. There you go. That's crazy. All right. Well, if you know Andy, you don't want to miss next week's message and or the podcast. And so if there's anything that we didn't get to today that you'd like to know more, you know, something we said, didn't say, should have said, 407-965-1607 or podcast at wholelife.church, and you can send in your questions and we will get to them next week, and we'll make Andy answer them next week.
Absolutely.
So
there you go.
Send in the hardest questions you have, and
I've got about 3 or 4 in mind. So
we'll bomb Andy with the good questions.
Anonymous asks.
Oh man. Well, now Andy's going to about midweek. He'll be like, "Well, sorry guys, something came up. Not sure I can make it this week." But in all seriousness, join us next week, and we look forward to having y'all back. And in the meantime, have a great week.